We tell ourselves that a forest dies from the outside, that ruin arrives with strangers, the axe carried in from a distant kingdom, the fire lit by a hand that never loved the trees. It is a comforting belief because it lets us imagine that a green place, if only it were left alone, would simply go on standing, that the one thing a forest needs is to be spared. The Grizzly Hills of Northrend refuse that comfort. Here, in the tall pine country of the far north, where the snow lies deep beneath trees old enough to have forgotten the sun, the deepest wound was not opened by an enemy. It was opened by those who came to heal, and beneath even them, older than the furbolgs who made these hills their home, older than the bear gods who once ruled the ridgelines, there was already a claim laid upon this land, a black resource buried in the dark, bleeding slowly upward through the roots. Before the first outsider ever raised a blade over these forests, the ground itself belonged to something that had never agreed to give it up. So the question that has followed me through this country is not the simple one, not who felled the trees. The harder question is this: what becomes of a place when every hand that reaches for it, friend and enemy alike, reaches only to take, and when the taking began underground, long before anyone above ever thought to call the forest their own? I am Keeper Aldrich, and I have walked the Grizzly Hills with my breath fogging in the cold, and the great trunks rising around me like the pillars of a cathedral no god still attends. In my years with the Explorers League, I learned to read a land the way one reads a face, and this land wears the expression of something that has been asked to give and give until there is almost nothing left to give. It is beautiful. That is the first cruelty of it. The pines climb the hills in dark ranks, the rivers run clear and cold over stone, and the air carries a scent so clean it aches. It is the kind of place that makes newcomers reach for their purses and their saws before they have even finished admiring it. And reach they have. When the war against the Lich King drew the wider world north, the Grizzly Hills, which the Alliance and the Horde had until then dismissed as an untamed and forgotten frontier, suddenly filled with those who saw not a home, but an inventory. The goblins of the Venture Company were first among the industrious, and they came with the patience of accountants, clear-cutting the timber, breaking the stone for ore, damming the rivers, turning a living country into raw material to be shipped elsewhere and sold. The independent human trappers who had lived quietly in these hills for generations, running their trading posts and taking only what the animals could spare, found themselves suddenly one interest among many. The Alliance settled their woodsmen at Amberpine Lodge. The Horde raised their banners at Conquest Hold, and between them, at places with names as plain as their purpose, the Blue Sky Logging Grounds, the Black River Logging Camp, the wide flat water of Venture Bay, two great powers began to fight, day after day, over the right to be the ones who cut the forest down. Consider what that means. Two peoples who had crossed an ocean to fight the greatest evil their world had ever known, paused in the middle of that war to spill each other's blood over lumber, over the privilege of extraction. From what survives of those days, the daily skirmishes at the logging camps were as bitter and as constant as any battle against the scourge. The forest did not care which flag flew over the sawmill. To the trees, it was all the same axe. This is where most tellings of the Grizzly Hills would begin and end, a tragedy of greed, of a wilderness carved up by latecomers who mistook a sacred country for a warehouse. and that telling is true as far as it goes. But it goes only to the surface. To understand why this particular forest draws such hunger, why every people who enters it seems compelled to strip something away, one must go down, past the sawdust and the churned mud, past the roots, into the black stone where the real story of this land was written long before any goblin ever sharpened a blade. Beneath the Grizzly Hills, and beneath much of Northrend besides, there runs a substance the world would come to call Sorrow Night. It is mined and forged and worn as armor by those who do not know what it is, or who know and do not care. But Sorrow Night is not ore in any honest sense. It is blood. It is the congealed, seeping blood of an old god, Yogg-Saron, the beast with 1,000 maws, one of those ancient and unspeakable things that were bound in chains beneath the skin of the world in ages before mortal memory. Its prison lies deep, sealed by the will of powers greater than any of us. But a prison is not a grave, and a bound god, even bound, still bleeds. I have stood in the silence of Ulduar, that vast Titan-built vault where the worst of these creatures were sealed away, and I will tell you plainly that no chronicle prepares you for the feeling of it, the sense of a mind pressing against the stone, patient beyond patience, older than patience itself. The Sorrow Night that surfaced across Northrend was the outward sign of that pressure. Where the blood welled up, corruption followed, spreading through the land like rot through fruit. So before we speak of a single tree being cut, we must sit with a stranger and more unsettling truth. This forest did not belong first to the furbolgs, or to the bear gods, or to any creature that walked beneath its branches. Read closely, the record carries a colder implication than it first admits, that in the deepest sense the land was already claimed, already the resource of something buried, bleeding, and awake. Every green thing that grew in these hills grew over an open wound. The forest was the wound's bandage. It always had been. Which brings us to the ones who came to heal and made the wound worse than any goblin ever could. Some 4,500 years before the dark portal ever opened, when the Sorrow Night had begun to spread through Northrend like a stain across cloth, a group of night elf druids of the Cenarian Circle looked north and saw not an inventory, but a sickness, and resolved to cure it. They were led by Fandral Staghelm, a druid of enormous will and enormous pride, and their intention, at least at the start, was one I find difficult to condemn. They wished to stop the spread of the old god's blood, to seal the wound with living wood, and so they turned to the one power in all the world they believed could do it. Far to the south stood Andrassil, the great world tree, grown by the dragon aspects themselves to seal a wound of a different kind, and blessed with gifts no mortal hand could give. From that sacred tree, Fandral and his closest followers cut branches, not one, but several, and carried them across the world, planting them wherever the Sorrow Night had risen, meaning to raise living guardians over the poisoned ground. Great trees took root in distant places from those cuttings, but the largest branch of all they saved for the north, for the very heart of the sickness, planting it above the greatest Sorrow Night growth in the mountains of Northrend. From it rose a new world tree, and they named it Andrassil, the crown of the snow. Here is the detail that turns the whole story, and it is easy to read past without feeling its weight. They did this without the blessing of the aspects. Northrend itself had been sanctified by dragons. Its power was anchored, protected, held in check by the guardianship of those ancient beings. Andrassil had none of that. It was a crown cut from a blessed tree and driven into cursed ground with nothing to guard it. When Malfurion, Stormrage, and the rest of the Cenarian Circle learned what Fandral had done, planting world trees across Azeroth without their knowledge or consent, they were furious. And the likeliest reading of that fury is not mere wounded pride. They understood something Fandral, in his certainty, had not paused to fear. A power severed from its guardian is not a shield. It is a door. But for a time, and this is the part that makes the tragedy so complete, it worked. For decades, Andrassil towered over Northrend, vast and green and seemingly triumphant, and all appeared well. The Druids had every reason to believe they had won. They had taken the greatest gift of the natural world and used it as a tool against the corruption beneath, and the corruption, for a while, seemed to recede. This is the seduction hidden inside every act of encroachment, dressed as salvation. For a season, the taking looks like healing. The forest planted over the wound looks like a forest. It is only later, when the roots have grown long enough, that anyone learns what they have been reaching toward. Because Andrassil's roots did not stop at the Sorrow Night, they kept growing deeper and deeper, blind and searching in the dark, until they touched the prison of Yogg-Saron itself. And the old god, which had waited beneath that stone with the patience of a thing that measures time in ages, understood at once what had been handed to it. A world tree with no guardian. A living thing rooted directly into its cell, threaded through the whole of the north, connected by unseen channels to the dreaming heart of the world. It did not need to break its chains. It only needed to whisper. And so the corruption that the Druids had come to stop began to flow the other way, up through the roots they had planted, into the trunk they had raised, out into every living thing that drew breath in the tree's long shadow. The first sign was madness. From what the chronicles preserve, the violence began among peoples who had never been enemies. The Tonka, a proud people kin to the Tauren, hardened by the northern cold and long accustomed to bending the elements to their will, and the forest nymphs of the wild places fell suddenly and inexplicably upon one another, and the fighting was not the ordinary brutality of border disputes. It was something worse, sudden, vicious, filled with acts too vile for reason to explain. Creatures that had no cause to hate each other tore each other apart, and no one could say why. Word traveled slowly in the far north, but in time it reached the Druids, and the Cenarian Circle sent an expedition to find the source of the sickness. What they found, I suspect, they carried for the rest of their long lives. They found that the cure had become the disease, that the tree they had raised to seal the wound had instead opened it wider, had become a great living conduit for the very corruption they had crossed the world to stop. And they understood, with the particular horror of those who cannot blame anyone but themselves, that there was no saving it. Andrassil could not be cleansed. It could not be spared. It could only be destroyed. So the Druids who had planted the crown of the snow returned to fell it with their own hands. They killed the thing they had made, and when it was done, when the great tree lay broken across the hills, they gave it a new name to mark what it had become. No longer Andrassil, the crown of the snow. Now Vordrassil, the broken crown. I have stood beneath what remains of it. The trunk did not vanish when the tree died. It fell in great segments across the west of these hills, and where those segments struck the earth, They rooted and festered, and around them a foul darkness still gathers even now. The furbolgs would later give those places names that read like the stations of a grief: Vordrassil's heart, Vordrassil's limb, Vordrassil's tears. To walk among them is to walk through the wreckage of good intentions, and there are few things in this world heavier to carry than that. But the true cost of the felling was not the broken tree, and this is the part that took me longest to understand. The Druids had come to contain a corruption. In cutting Andrassil down, they believed they had done exactly that: stopped the spread of the sorrow night, sealed the door they had accidentally opened, and paid for their pride with heartbreak and nothing more. They were wrong, because a world tree, even a doomed one, is not only rooted in soil. It is rooted in the emerald dream, the vast slumbering reflection of all living things. And in the brief time that Andrassil stood tainted, Yogg-Saron had used it as a doorway not only into the waking world, but into the dream itself. Small seeds of corruption slipped through that door and took root in the sleeping green, where they could not be reached by any axe. The Druids felled the tree and told themselves the danger was ended. What they had actually done was plant, in the dream of the world, the first seeds of the emerald nightmare, a horror that would not fully bloom for thousands of years. Sit with that a moment. Every act of taking in this story, even the righteous ones, even the ones performed in grief and good faith, made the next act of taking possible. The Druids reached for the world's greatest gift to solve a problem, and in doing so, opened a wound in the world's very dreams. The forest did not simply suffer the consequences of encroachment. It became the mechanism by which encroachment reached places nothing else could touch. That is the shape of the cost. It is never only what you take. It is what your taking makes reachable to everything that comes after. And what came after, in these hills, was a people who loved this land more than any Druid ever did, and who, out of that love, took the deepest cut of all. Long before the tree, before any Druid ever looked north, the Grizzly Hills belonged to the bears. 2 cubs roamed these ridges in the earliest ages, adventurous and wild, and they grew into something far greater than beasts. They became Ursoc and Ursul, the bear brothers, wild gods of enormous power and ancient dignity. Ursoc in particular ruled over this country as a living god ruling a living land, and he did not rule it alone. From what survives, he roamed the hills with his own children at his side, the great bears Orson and Codian. To the furbolgs, the bear folk who made these forests their home, Ursoc was not a distant deity to be feared. He was kin. He was the father of the world they knew. Then came the War of the Ancients, 10,000 years gone, when the Burning Legion first descended upon the world, and the ancient defenders rose to meet it. In that war, among so many others, Ursoc fell. The chronicles do not preserve the manner of his death, only its shape and its cost. The great bear god died, and the furbolgs who worshipped him were left with the oldest and most human grief there is, the grief of children who have outlived a parent and cannot accept it. The furbolgs endured. They gathered their scattered tribes and built, in the very center of these hills, a city unlike anything their nomadic people had ever raised. They called it Grizzlemaw, and here the layers of this story fold in upon one another in a way I find almost unbearable to consider, because the furbolgs did not build their great capital on ordinary ground. They built it from the shattered trunk of Vordrassil itself. They made their home inside the corpse of the felled world tree, which had grown over the blood of a bound god in the country where their own god lay dead, a dwelling of the dead, atop the dead, above the sleeping. For generations they lived there in relative peace, worshipping the memory of Ursoc, keeping no quarrel even with the Drakari trolls to the north. And for those generations, the peace held. But grief does not fade so easily in the hearts of the faithful. For centuries, the furbolgs of Grizzlemaw turned over a single desperate hope, that their god need not stay dead, that if they could only find the power, they might bring Ursoc back. And in the end, they found it, or believed they had, in the last place any of them should have reached. The wood beneath their feet, the seeds of Vordrassil still scattered through the ruined trunk, still faintly humming with the stolen power of a world tree. The furbolgs began to regrow the tree, to coax a sapling from the corruption, and to draw upon its magic to resurrect their fallen god. You already know what was in that wood. They did not. Or perhaps some of them suspected and loved their god too much to stop. Either way, the taint of Yogg-Saron, dormant in the seeds all those long years, woke as the sapling grew, and it poured into the furbolgs of Grizzlemaw exactly as it had once poured into the Tonka and the nymphs. A people who had lived in peace for generations were turned, almost overnight, into creatures of bloodlust and madness. Tribe fell upon tribe. Where there had been one people gathered in mourning, there were now the Red Fang and the Frostpaw, at war with a savagery neither could have explained, tearing apart the very city they had built to hold their grief. The best of intentions counted for nothing against so strong a corruption, and the resurrection itself succeeded, which was the cruelest outcome of all. Ursoc returned, but the god who came back through that tainted wood was not the god who had died. He returned corrupted, twisted by the same darkness that had claimed his worshippers, a ruined echo of the father the furbolgs remembered. His own children knew it at once. Orson and Codian, the great bears who had roamed these hills at their father's side, recognized that the thing wearing their father's shape carried the same poison as the oozes festering around Vordrassil's broken limbs. In the end, it fell to outsiders and to a furbolg of another tribe to do what the grief-stricken could not, to burn the sapling, to gather and destroy its seeds, and to face the corrupted god in his own den. Only when they had put him down and anointed his body with the ashes of the tree that had ruined him was Ursoc's true spirit at last set free. And that spirit, released from its long torment, did not thank them with comfort. It gave them a warning. The druids of old had been wise to tear down Vordrassil, it said, for its roots reached into the dwelling of an ancient evil, and that evil's reach, it warned, extended far beyond the roots of any single tree. I return often to this part of the story because it is the part that breaks the easy moral. It would be simple to say that the Grizzly Hills were ruined by outsiders, by goblins and armies, and the greed of latecomers who saw only lumber and ore. But the furbolgs were not outsiders. They belonged to this land as completely as anything can belong to a place, and still they took. They looked at the most sacred thing in their world, the dead tree that was their home, the last relic of the power that had shaped their hills, and they saw in it a resource, a means, a way to reach through death and pull their god back into the world. Their love was real, their grief was real, and their love and grief became, in the end, one more hand reaching into the forest to take something it was never meant to hold. This is the truth that the surface-telling misses entirely. Encroachment is not always the crime of the stranger. Sometimes it is the crime of the devoted. Sometimes the deepest cut into a sacred place is made by the ones who kneel before it, which leaves only the final layer and the strangest, the layer where the takers themselves become the thing that is taken. By the time the wider world arrived in force, the Grizzly Hills had become a country where nearly everything and everyone was being harvested by someone. The trees by the logging camps, the stone by the venture companies' mines, the dead by the scourge who had seized the ancient troll fortress of Yogg-Saron Keep in the north and turned even the bones of the fallen into raw material for a growing army. Deep in the eastern hills, the ruined city of Thor Modan told a stranger version of the same story, for its iron dwarves were less harvesters than a harvest themselves, a people forged as an obedient army, made, from what the records suggest, by one of the Titan's own appointed keepers, after that keeper had himself been twisted by the very old god whose blood seeps beneath these roots. Made to serve and to ask no questions, they warred without end amid the wreckage of their fallen capital against the stone giants who barraged their broken halls with boulders and uprooted trees, a manufactured folk fighting over the bones of a manufactured city. Everywhere one looked, the forest and its people were being reduced patiently and thoroughly into things that could be used. Not everyone who came to these hills came to take. Some came only because there was nowhere left to go. The Tonka, that same hardy people the corruption had once driven to madness in the age of Andrassil, arrived in this later time as refugees, their own northern homelands devoured by the scourge, their herds scattered, and their sacred grounds lost. Under Tormak the Scarred, they raised a camp at Onequa and threw in their lot with the horde, not out of any hunger for conquest, but out of the plain arithmetic of a dying people who wished to go on living. And yet even they, arriving with empty hands and honest grief, became one more weight, pressing down upon a land already claimed a dozen times over. This is the quieter cruelty of encroachment, the one the histories rarely name. It does not only breed takers, it breeds the displaced, who must lean for their very survival upon ground that is already being pulled apart beneath their feet, until even the act of seeking shelter becomes, against every intention, another demand the forest is asked to answer. But the darkest expression of it fell upon the trappers, the quiet human folk who had lived longest and lightest on this land. When the Lich King raised the long-dead Archmage Aragorn from his grave and set his shade loose in these hills, it was not the timber that Aragorn came to harvest. It was the people. Through the cult that gathered around him, the wolf cult, the Worgen curse spread through the trapper villages of Silverbrook and Solstice Village, turning men and women who had asked nothing of the world but a little fur and a little peace into savage beasts, bound in service to a dead sorcerer on his island of Blood Moon. Here was the final turn of the whole terrible wheel. The ones who had lived by taking modestly from the forest were themselves taken, not for their goods, not for their land, but for their very bodies and minds, made into weapons and drained of everything they had been. The harvesters harvested, the takers taken. And here is the bitterest thing the Grizzly Hills ever taught me. That great war between the Alliance and the Horde, the blood spilled day after day at Venture Bay and the logging grounds, the banners raised at Amberpine and at Conquest Hold, the whole grinding contest over which flag would fly above the sawmills. In the end, it settled nothing at all. The armies had their war, and in time they spent it. The quarrel over the region cooled and finally went quiet, but the forest did not win that peace. When the fighting drained away, it was the goblins who remained, as goblins so often do, and the venture company simply returned to the work it had begun. The mining, the felling, the tireless reduction of a living country into cargo to be shipped and sold. Control of Venture Bay passed back into their hands as though no war had ever been fought over it. All that struggle over who deserved to take the forest apart, and the answer, when at last it came, was that it scarcely mattered who. The taking outlived every taker. It waited out the armies the way the wound beneath the roots waits out everything, patient and unhurried, and when the noise had faded, it simply picked up the saw again. And when you set all of it side by side, the gods' blood claiming the ground, the druids claiming the world's greatest gift to fight that blood, the furbolgs claiming their own sacred tree to reclaim their god, the goblins claiming the timber, the factions claiming the right to claim the timber, the Lich King claiming the trappers themselves, a single terrible pattern emerges from the whole. In the Grizzly Hills, everyone who arrives comes to take, and each taker, sooner or later, becomes the raw material for the taker who follows. The forest is not merely exploited, it is a mirror held up to every hand that reaches into it, and what the mirror shows is that the hand which grasps will, in time, be grasped. This is the true cost of encroachment, and it is far heavier than the loss of any single tree. When a place becomes everyone's resource, it stops being a place at all. It becomes a wound, and a wound draws hands the way an open wound draws the cold. The taking does not end when the taker is satisfied, because the taking was never really about satisfaction. It was about the wound, and beneath these hills, patient beyond patience, the wound is still bleeding. The beast with 1,000 maws still waits at the bottom of every root, and it was its blood, seeping upward through the dark, that first taught this land to be taken. So I return, at the last, to the question I carried into these hills. Not who felled the trees. That question was always too small. The question was, what becomes of a place when every hand that reaches for it reaches only to take? And now I think I know the shape of the answer, though I find no comfort in it. What becomes of such a place is that it teaches. A forest made into everyone's resource does not simply suffer the taking, it passes the taking on. The Sorrow Night taught the land to be claimed. The Druids, reaching to heal, taught the world's dream to be corrupted. The furbolgs, reaching to love, taught their own sacred tree to be plundered. And the sorcerer, reaching for power, taught the gentlest people in these hills that even they could be reduced to raw material. Every hand that grasped left the ground a little more grasping. That is how a wound spreads, not through malice alone, but through the long, patient lesson that everything here is for the taking. And yet, the pines still climb these hills in their dark and ancient ranks. The rivers still run clean over the stone. Somewhere in the broken heart of Grizzlemaw, the furbolgs endure, fewer and sadder than they were, but not gone. Ursoc's true spirit walks free at last. The broken crown lies where it fell, and around its scattered remnants the forest has begun, slowly and stubbornly, to grow again. Green rising once more over blood that never dried, over a god that never truly slept. It is not healing. I am too old to call it healing. But it is persistence, which is perhaps the only answer a forest ever has to those who would strip it bare. The taking never truly stops in the Grizzly Hills, but neither, it seems, does the growing. Whether that is hope or only endurance, I leave for you to decide. The fire has burned low, the snow is falling again beyond the pines, and there are older wounds than this one still waiting in the dark to be remembered. For now, this record is closed.